Well, good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome. It's a great pleasure to be introducing this seventh lecture in our series, and a particular pleasure to be introducing Sir Paul Tucker. Sir Paul, I've known Sir Paul probably for, 20 or so, 25 years. And just before this occasion, I asked him, have you had two employers in his long career? He started in 1980, coming down from Trinity, Cambridge. And he said, no, I've only really had one. And that's the Bank of England. Paul rose through the Bank of England and became Deputy Governor. And many of us expected and hoped to become governor, but that wasn't to be. So he moved on at the start of Art Carney's governorship. And can I just say here that I think it's an incredible tribute to you, Paul, that you could have got a couple of three well-paying sinecures in the City of London and taken life easy and lived in Kensington and Chelsea and the rest of it. No, you didn't do that. You went into the wilds of academia and brave and all these seminars and debates and controversies and really, as far as I can make up, basically just pro bono. Started to write about, as a fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School, to write about central banking, about the institutions of the banking world, the financial world, the international world. And so there was a book came out on unelected power a couple, 3 years back, perhaps 4 or 5 years back now. And then last year, there was this fabulous book, Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured World Order. And so Paul's kind of pioneering a new topic. It's not geopolitics, it's geoeconomics. So I put it to you that this sort of book is establishing his intellectual leadership in this new field. And that's what we're going to hear about this evening. Without any more ado from me, I think we should be very grateful that we've got Sir Paul talking to us this evening. I'm looking forward very much to your talk. And can we welcome Sir Paul Tucker? Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you very, very much indeed, and thank you to the Institute. I was reading you before we met. I should think it was a bit more than 25 years ago, but in the early 1980s when I was a supervisor, because I could see that central banking was about a bit more than banks, I would read Tim Congdon and Gordon Pepper and all of these people that were following the monetary aggregates, and thought, I better make sense of this. Charles Goodhart, read him as well. Better try and move around this central banking business. I did actually, because we got distracted by Hong Kong, I didn't say that I did actually have a second employer, which was Harvard for a few years, so somebody else wanted me. So novels are quite interesting because they tell you about a period, and some of you will have read Saramago. There's a marvelous bit towards the beginning of Saramago's novel, Ricardo Rice, not our friend at the LSE, but a kind of another Ricardo Rice, a rather complicated fictional character, in fact. And he is arriving back in Lisbon, having been in Brazil for around 16 years. This is the time of Salazar, so it's no small thing to come back. And in fact, he's returning because Pessoa has passed away. And of course, he has no local currency. And he gets off the boat with lots of luggage, and he's looking for a porter. And he says to the porter, I have only English money. Oh, that's fine. And he saw 10 shillings placed into his right hand, coins that shone more brightly than the sun itself. That's what it was in the 1930s, where the novel is set, to be given sterling. That, of course, today would be dollars. Anybody that's travelled kind of with a rucksack in the kind of tougher parts of the world will know that if you can pull dollars from your pocket, you can probably get to the end of the day and into tomorrow. And this is an extraordinary thing about being the hegemon that issues the main reserve currency. And I want to talk about geopolitics and geoeconomics and shifts in the world order, and about monetary stability and how monetary stability is crucial to the world order, and how that therefore makes it even more urgent that various reforms are made to the monetary system, and in particular the system of monetary policy in the richest countries. So I'm going to start off kind of not at a high level, but at a broad level, and I'm going to gradually get narrower and narrower. Tim has been kind enough to mention my book. I argue in the book, and I believe this, that I think the contest between the People's Republic and the West will take decades and decades. It could easily go on for a century. For what it's worth, I think the best comparator is not the struggle between our country and the Second Reich or the Cold War, but our country and France in the long 18th century, from roughly 1689 to 1815, because that's the nearest global contest that was everywhere in everything. The Cold War wasn't in everything, obviously, because the Soviet bloc had backed out of international commerce. Evenly matched, neither can knock out the other side, and ideological. The Second Reich British struggle wasn't very ideological. For those of you that are involved in finance and economics, if and when China stumbles in the coming months, maybe next week, I expect the response from the city and Wall Street and elsewhere to be, well, that's it, back to normal. This is like Japan, and I think it'll be nothing like that. China doesn't rely on the security umbrella, and it's vast, and it could probably continue to increase its hard power, even as its economy moves sideways. I think this contest, which will have peaceful bits and non-peaceful bits, I think it will play out partly through international organizations and regimes, which I'll come on to in a moment, and I think it will render completely antiquated the world of policy silos that my generation and the generation before me lived in. You could be a monetary policy maker without knowing anything about trade policy. You had to know about trade economics. You didn't have to know about trade policy. I think that's finished. In fact, I don't think you can do any economic policy without knowing when the interests of the security people, the war and peace people, are implicated. And to give an example of that, a story from when I was still at the Bank of England, which I left a long time ago now. Somebody walks into my room, I think I'm Deputy Governor then, because I can remember the room I'm in, and they say, oh, India has refused, the Federal Reserve has refused India a swap line. It doesn't matter what a swap line is, it's just a line of credit from the Central Bank of America to the Central Bank of India, collateralized by the Indian currency. The technical stuff doesn't matter at all. All that matters is that India wants this swap line in order to help them get through the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So this person comes in and says, the Federal Reserve have refused India a swap line, and it's done. And I say back, don't they realize India is going to be a power? And my point inside my head was, this is above a central banker's pay grade. Now, I said it was ideological, and I've got two questions I want to ask you. And I ask every time I present this little bit, I ask the question. So who has heard of Document 9, released in 2013? Hands up. 1, 2. That's about normal. I would say that the average, I've done loads of these talks in 3 continents now, the average is about 1% of the audience, and the variance is incredibly narrow. So Document 9 was leaked or released from the Central Committee of the party in 2013, and it sets out the 7 no's, 5 of which are very eloquent. It's an extremely well done document. An eloquent statement of what China is against, and telling the Chinese people and all businesses, think tanks, NGOs, not to discuss or promote any of the ideas of liberalism. I'm going or the standard list: free press, free speech, constitutionalism, basic rights, voting. It's not just that China's against those things, but actually they're not to be discussed anymore. 2013, just a little time after the elevation of leader Xi. When I started writing this book, which about 5 years ago, I suppose, I thought that there were 4 scenarios and that we were in the first and would remain in the first for a while, drifting into the second superpower struggle. I now think we are in superpower struggle, between superpower struggle and new Cold War, and I think we will oscillate in that world for quite a long time. New World Order, I think, doesn't beckon until India does rise to be a power, and possibly Indonesia. In fact, I think being a superpower is open to anybody with a vast population that manages to grow relatively rapidly for a couple of decades. To give you an example of how this infects the international system of organization, I want to ask another question. Who knows about the state-owned enterprises subsidies case that went to the through the WTO trade dispute system, also around a decade ago? The fact that you don't know about these things, by the way, is because the media was not reporting on the things that were most important in terms of the fabric of the world. This is an amazing story. So China was using its, and does use its, state-owned enterprises to subsidize other businesses' exports. And after a while, Washington says, you can't do that. Subsidies are against the law, against the international law, the treaty obligations of the WTO. You must stop, or we will be entitled to put in place countervailing measures. That's the term of art. It just means we'll put tariffs in place that undo your subsidies. One pulls prices down for US customers, the other pushes prices up. Beijing responds, no, you're right that they're subsidies. They're not illegal subsidies. We've got a dispute. They go through the dispute system. They reach the appellate board, and the appellate board indeed concludes in favor of China on the intriguing reason, although this isn't the most important thing, it is amazing, on the intriguing reason that it turns out that state-owned enterprises aren't to be thought of as public bodies within the meaning of the treaty, because Charles is laughing, exactly. In another life, Charles, in fact, you've got uncles and cousins that are great judges. You could have been doing this. And so this is an unconscionable decision, where rather like the US Supreme Court, the appellate board is just out of its depth. So here's why this matters. So what would normally happen in circumstances of this kind over the past 300-400 years is you've got a kind of problem and you want to flip away from law back to diplomacy and bargaining. So there would be a kind of bargaining session between the United States, between Washington and Beijing, and they'd make a bit of progress leading towards China giving up some of its gains, but holding on to others. And when they'd made enough progress, they'd bring in the other great trade powers plural perhaps, the EU and Japan, and they'd come up with something, and they'd come up with a formula that did this, and it would become part of international law. Except the WTO has a provision, unlike the GATT, the WTO has a provision that any member, and it's got lots and lots of members, let's say 150, any member can veto changes to the treaty. So actually the treaty is unamendable. So there are two things that follow from that, of which the second is even more important than the first. The first is, which is remarkable if you were a kind of public sector clerk growing up, is the people writing the WTO treaty, they think they are writing the perfect treaty, because it's never going to be possible to change it. It's merely going to be interpreted by the appellate board. And the second point is, and it's going to be interpreted by the appellate board in a benign world. And what does a benign world mean? A benign world means that, of course, other countries are going to come along and subsidize stuff, and that's all going to be very irritating, but they're not going to be that big. They're not going to be powers. They're certainly not going to be superpowers. So as the WTO treaty is being This really is an end of history moment. I, for a long time, thought there wasn't an end of history moment. I think there was. The people that are drafting this treaty and signing it, including people in London, they think there will never be another great power that does not subscribe to the basic liberal notions of trade that inform the GATT and inform the WTO. And I think this is the best example that something is seriously is broken. So there's an extraordinary connection between being the security hegemon and being the issuer of the dominant international reserve currency, and it flows both ways. The way that's obvious to people in this room, or many people in this room, is that if you issue the world's reserve currency, you're going to be able to borrow more cheaply, your companies are going to be able to borrow more cheaply, and that's actually going to make it slightly cheaper than otherwise to have a disproportionate share of your GDP go into hard power stuff. But it runs the other way as well. Historians have documented in really fascinating ways the extent to which the use of a reserve currency is often tied to security relations. The best example of this in living memory, well, I'll mention one other. In the 1930s, as the war with Japan was developing in China, the Americans went to China and tried to persuade the Chinese government to switch from using sterling to using dollars. Much more significantly, in the 1970s, Bretton Woods comes to an end. Some people think of that as a system created in 1944-45 coming to an end. It's much better to think of it as, after 2.5 centuries, we're off a commodity standard. We're on fiat money. No one knows how to run a fiat money in anything like a prudent way. And people in Washington are really worried that this is going to threaten the dollar's status as an international currency, just as elsewhere they're pushing the British back territorially and trying to fill the vacuum that we leave before Stalin fills it. But they're particularly worried about use of the dollar. And so there is a joint mission from the State Department and US Treasury to Saudi Arabia to present them with a deal. I think it's not a pact or anything like that. It's just an informal deal, which is, we will step up our supply of security stuff for you if you promise to carry on invoicing your energy exports in dollars. So when you read about maybe Saudi exports to, or Iranian exports to China are now being denominated in renminbi, this isn't a thing for energy economists and energy policymakers, important people though they are. This is the very highest level stakes indeed. And we should expect China to be absolutely determined and patient about having their currency widely used. The force of this came to me, this is another kind of war story, through the crisis. So the United States is absolutely the epicenter of the great financial crisis, some combination of mendacity and incompetence, in fact, kind of all things that are bad. They blow up the world economy. If this happened to anybody else, their borrowing rates for the government would go through the roof and their currency would sink. And in fact, there was a run into US Treasury bills and short-term US Treasury bonds. This is if you're sitting in Washington, if you're sitting in the White House or the Treasury, or the State Department or the Fed during that period, this is a gift from God or from the gods. And the Chinese authorities would be eccentric if they didn't want some of that, if they didn't want. They know that they will eventually make mistakes and they will want that kind of cushion. I want to say something about principles for policymakers. I'll do the three musts. The three musts, of course, are framed in the kind of the rhetorical form of whoever my opposite numbers were in Beijing. So I have the three musts. The three musts are avoid dangerous overdependence in a scary world. This is the business of de-risking. I was advocating de-risking and, if you like, decoupling before it became a slogan. It of course can overshoot. And if it overshoots and we go into a protectionist spiral, that will impoverish the world in terrible ways. But that just means that it needs to be done carefully and sensibly. But it needs to be done because being overly dependent on a power that is certainly a threat and could turn out to be an enemy, and this is symmetric, by the way, would be a reckless thing to do. I want to say that I don't think multinational corporations, or very few of them, leaders of them, have got their heads around this at all. So a few months ago, the Financial Times reported that the big boss at Mercedes said, withdrawing from China is unthinkable. So you just pass that a bit. If withdrawing from China is unthinkable, that means that withdrawing from the United States and Europe is thinkable, or alternatively, that he hadn't thought about it. Or I suppose that he wasn't going to admit to thinking about it, but it's still, even if he'd thought about it, it wasn't a wise thing to say, because the cheap comment I made, you bet that will have been noticed in Washington. You bet. Because they'll be monitoring everything that is said. Right? My point isn't to have a go at this man. It's that I think that leaders of multinational companies can't get their heads around the possibility that the world could fracture away again and fracture in really ugly ways for commerce. There's a company called RAC, which in the run-up to the First World War was split in two. First World War, into an American bit. The Americans seized the German bit. It is still separate from the German company called Merck. There are two Mercks in the world. The family, it's a Mittelstand, the family and families that own Merck have never been able to and will never be able to get their American property back. They understand, by the way, what can happen when security policy trumps commercial policy. The second of the three musts is make friends, keep them, and make what allies you have. Allies is stronger, of course, everywhere and always. This is more for Washington than here, and so I would say more about this in Washington. They haven't been terribly good at this. They have been good, and therefore not good, at losing interest in parts of the world, Central Asia, parts of the Middle East, their own backyard to some extent in Latin America. You can't actually be, you can only do that as the hegemon if you take it for granted that there isn't anybody else that will ever rise. That's why I think it's interesting that our media didn't ensure that we all knew about Document 9 in 2013. And then the third one is, you think about superpowers is that they're full of talented, determined, kind of far-sighted people. The key thing about not prevailing but holding on to our way of life will be not to make fatal mistakes at home and abroad. And there are lots of things to be said about that, but I want to say something about monetary affairs. A precondition for any society political society that can flourish at all is that there's some kind of basic order at home and in the world. And certainly at home, basic order relies, among many other things, on there being some degree of monetary stability. The 20th century is littered with examples of political instability following monetary instability, most obviously in the middle of the 20th century. But also, we have seen, even in our generation, 2 generations here probably, the extent to which a massive banking crisis fractures confidence in the state. During the last financial crisis, my former colleague, boss, friend, Mervyn King, you held a dinner to discuss the cultural and social effects of the crisis. This was great fun, but it was also a kind of shrewd and far-sighted thing to do because you were dead right. And we are still living in this country, in the United States, and in continental Europe with the pain inflicted on our societies by a banking crisis that wouldn't have been very hard to avoid if policymakers had bothered to remember that banks are fragile things and bankers will never themselves remember that, which is kind of why we have institutions to remember it for them. So kind of a broad way of framing where I'm about to go is over the last few years, since a number of us left central banking, central banks have got interested in other things. They've got interested in inclusive growth. I'll give an example of that. They've got interested in climate change. And this has kind of been a broadening of perspective. And my central message is actually there is a need to broaden the perspective to a world of geopolitical and geoeconomical stress and tension, and that what that means for central banking is to narrow one's own focus on the basic elements of monetary system stability. That to be broad, to contribute what central banks need to contribute to our long-term interests, they have to return to focusing on price stability and the stability of the banking system. So I want to say, I don't want to dwell too much on this because everyone knows this already. Not everyone did know it always, but it was always there to be known. It's been a peculiar few years. I mean, I think quite a few people, including me, including the person that I helped teach a small course with in Harvard, we thought that when COVID blew up in the spring of 2020, what was needed was a market maker of last resort operation, of course, to stabilize the government bond market. And when that's done, label it as market maker of last resort. When you've done that, back out again, and actually have some fun selling the bonds. Probably not meant to have fun, but you don't. What you don't do is take it as a prompt to carry on adding to QE, trying to stimulate aggregate demand in circumstances when aggregate supply has largely been closed down. So that's the first episode. The second episode, slightly different in the US and here, but a big warning signal from the US. Massive Biden fiscal package in the spring of 2021. I think criticism of the package itself is misplaced. In terms of macroeconomics, what was needed was for the Fed to start tightening monetary policy. Fiscal policymakers do what they do. The whole point of an independent central bank is to let them do the distributional stuff, the social stuff, but to offset, if necessary, the effects on aggregate demand and pushing the economy into imbalance. Here it was not so much fiscal, it was the withdrawal of, some of you will know better, roughly 500,000 people from the labour force. It matters a lot who they are. If they're young and have long COVID, they, as well as withdrawing their labour, they're probably withdrawing their spending. But if it's people of the age sitting towards the front, leaving the labour force just a few years before they were planning to, their labour supply has gone down, but actually their spending has probably continued. So these are conditions where you get, both sides of the Atlantic, conditions where you get excess demand. Here, it seems from a distance, a bit less true in the States, bit less true, is that there's been this kind of debate about, is this about price gouging or is it about kind of workers being militant? And it's about excess demand. And it's about monetary policy allowing there to be excess demand. So if we get excess demand, then what will happen is that firms will start to increase their prices and workers will want to catch up. I'm not even bringing in the cost shock from energy prices, but one can do that too. And in the public sector, that's going to be difficult because the public sector can't pass on the higher costs. But the workers will want compensating in one labour market for higher prices everywhere. And so it's not surprising that there are public sector strikes, and it's not very surprising that governments will face hard choices about cutting public services. And the only way through this was to bring the path of aggregate demand back in line with the path of aggregate supply, more or less, to take the excess demand out of the economy. In the United States, caused by a push to demand. In the United Kingdom, caused largely by a withdrawal of supply. None of this is about New Keynesian models. I will say this only once, but I would encourage you not to be distracted by the debates about this is all to do with New Keynesian models. In my time and before my time, the top people didn't kind of believe the models in that sense. To believe the model in that sense is to believe that you've reached the frontier of science, economic science, and there's nothing more to be learned, and you've arrived, and you know everything there is to be known about the economy. And as soon as you put it like that, you realize that it's absurd. But if you have the responsibility of making decisions that affect millions of people, you know the tools that you're using and the staff are using on your behalf. You know they are flawed. You know you have to think about what's going on in the economy and what doesn't kind of fit with the model. Now, here comes the kind of rub, and I'm starting with the United States because I want to dwell for a few moments on how in the kind of run-up to these recent inflationary problems, as late as 2020 in the United States, there were tweaks to the framework that I would say look quite peculiar at the time, but certainly look peculiar with the benefit of hindsight. So be clear, one can criticize this with hindsight, but I do not think hindsight was needed. So these next few slides are taken from a presentation that Don Cohn is going around making. Don Cohn was Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve, and before that a Governor, and before that Director for Monetary Affairs, and is a great man and is desperately loyal to the Fed. How did I get to the right place? Yeah, so the first thing, so the Fed did a review, and they changed their framework in 2019, and I only want to concentrate on a few things. They have a dual mandate in statute, but the Fed's own articulation of its framework had traditionally been that they were focused on inflation, employment, and long-term interest rates. And in 2019, in the Fed's documents, they changed the order from employment, inflation, and long-term interest rates. Not the biggest thing in the world, because both words are in statute, but you do have to choose to do that. You know, these things don't get signed off at staff level. These things get signed off at the very top. More interestingly, in the 2020 elaboration of the framework, in saying what they meant by employment, they said the maximum level of employment is a broad-based and inclusive goal that is not directly measurable and actually not directly controllable. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually have any instruments that can address inclusive growth. Hugely important, though, inclusive growth is. So this was, I believe, Don doesn't put it like this, I believe this was a nakedly politically move where different people in the Federal Reserve were motivated by different things, and my friend Jay Powell was motivated by seeking renomination at the chair as his term was coming up. Actually, he became a bit more hawkish between nomination and confirmation hearing, but that could be just a coincidence because of the data coming in. The other thing that became apparent during this period, although one did need to be a little bit of a kind of enthusiast for this stuff, so I didn't notice this next bit at the time, is that they made it clear that when they looked at the employment measure, they were looking at shortfalls against employment, but not the other way around. It had become asymmetric, which is quite a big thing. So the UK's version of this happened in 2013. No one is left, by the way. I'm rather feebly here when this happens, which is between me and my maker at some point. And the UK system works slightly differently. There's something in statute that says inflation, maintain price stability, and subject to that, be attentive to the government's other economic goals. And Parliament says, oh, government, you shall give the Bank of England a remit, which it does. And Gordon Brown and Ed Balls did that in 1997, and it didn't change for many years. And then in 2013, it did change. There was a paragraph encouraging the bank to adopt forward guidance, which rather irritated one of my colleagues at the time. But the really big thing was this. The remit went from a kind of rather anodyne statement of government economic policy to a bullet point statement of government policy. Politicians have caught the habit of bullet points. And the first one is amazing. It's the government's economic strategy consists of 4 pillars. This is only the first. Monetary activism and credit easing, stimulating demand, maintaining price stability, and supporting the flow of credit in the economy. So monetary activism comes before maintaining price stability, and it's effectively telling the Bank of England, so this is quite strange, this bit. We're a democracy, so it's absolutely, they're entitled to do it. I have no complaints at all that they did it. I think what interests me looking back is that there is no debate about it whatsoever. There are no editorials. The select committee doesn't come out and say, hold on, this independence thing was precisely to get away from maybe the Barber Boom stuff, competition and credit control. Maybe that was monetary activism. Maybe our late friend Nigel Lawson's little credit boom at the end of the 1980s was monetary activism. The whole point of Bank of England independence, which, for God's sake, the Bank of England isn't entitled to independence. It should only happen in a parliamentary democracy if it is, the whole idea is to insulate monetary policy from quotidian, from day-to-day politics, which doesn't really fit, I now suggest, which is why I need to see my maker, with monetary activism. I think that the UK framework needs to go back to basics. I think the statute should stay as it is. The remit from the Treasury to the bank has grown over time. To be fair, it's shrunk a bit recently. This seems to go with chancellors. The financial policy commit remit, which is a creature of Matt Hancock and mine, I mean, that's reasonably well known, it's true. That remit, Matt has grown from a few pages to well over a dozen pages. The last time I looked, I would go back to 2012 and decide for the MPC one, and decide if anything needs to be added at all. I think it is really important for at remit level to distinguish quantitative easing, which is a monetary policy tool, from market maker of last resort, which is a different kind of tool. I actually think, and I kind of want to gloss over this, but I think it's really important, I think the moment has come to explore whether it would be feasible to move to something like a judicial appointments commission for the top jobs in the Bank of England and in the Federal Reserve and in the ECB, a different kind of thing where the mandarins aren't involved in quite the same way and the politicians aren't involved in quite the same way, and even actually the hierarchy of the Bank of England isn't involved in quite the same way. So I'm kind of scattering around my pellets as I make that point, but I do think that something isn't quite as it was, and for those of you who think this is a bit dreary, I think this may be the most important thing I say. And then more prosaically, for you that make a business out of doing this, a few years ago, the inflation report, which reminded people that it was about inflation, got renamed the Monetary Policy Report, which invites the thought, we've conquered inflation, what can we use monetary policy for today? Loads of instruments. Someone like me can do lots and lots of things with those instruments. The whole point is to be constrained so that if inventive people like me don't do those things with them, but give the job that underlines the purpose of independence. And then also, as you open the cover, which I rarely do, add back some of the analytical content, undo the dumbing down, and certainly add back the monetary aggregates. And I'm not just saying this because I'm in Tim's company. In fact, I've said this on other occasions. And, you can learn lots of things by looking at the monetary aggregates. And there was a team that was devoted to doing that. And my worry about things that aren't in the published documents is, are they going on privately? And what I learned from Mervyn was that transparency was great for promoting efficiency and promoting accountability, both of which are completely true. It's also a brilliant management device. If you've committed to putting into the inflation report or to the financial policy committee report that we're always going to consider X, Y, and Z, that makes you do it, even when you're knackered. And I would also return to staggered announcements of the policy decisions, the forecasts, and the minutes, which journalists won't like. But I promise you, this empowers the chair, because if it's compressed that way, and that's less of a problem in the States, but the whole point of our setup was that governors should lead, but not control. This hands too much power to the governor of the day. And in passing, please don't introduce Fed-style dot plots, which haven't worked in the United States. I say one more thing. I want to say something about banking, and not only because Mervyn's here. So we've had three banking failures this year, a whole bunch in the United States, and a massive, massive one in Europe, Credit Suisse, which are to do with, very big picture, the authorities having decent plans and they're not applying them. In the United States case, because they decided following lobbying to exempt medium-sized banks from plans to deal with crises, I think this is indefensible, and I think it is interesting that those that are responsible for it haven't been called to defend themselves. In the Credit Suisse case, and I mustn't say too much on this because I was commissioned by the Swiss government to write a report on lender of last resort policy in the round, not about the particular case as such. I kind of wonder whether when it came to it, an apparently solvent bank, there wasn't enough eligible collateral in the right places so that people were caught short. And so Mervyn first, I second, actually in my view both drawing on something that our former colleague David Rule said about 20 years ago. We should be encouraging banks to pre-position with central banks enough eligible collateral to cover 100% of their liabilities. And exaggerating a bit, up till recently I thought of that as really useful in a crisis, which it would be. But it does something else. As a bank comes to me and says, well, we're positioned with this, well, I'm not taking that. And this is a reasonable not taking it, because it's a power station or it's a yacht moored off Myanmar, owned by a company in, I don't know, the Turks and Caicos, and you've got no idea how to collect your collateral if you ever own it outright. And so you say, well, haven't you got anything else? Haven't you got? Well, actually, no, I haven't. Well, then you can't finance yourself with runnable liabilities. You better finance yourself with long-term bonds and equity. That, by the way, in a few minutes, is a completely fundamental reform of banking that would make it much safer, more socially acceptable. It wouldn't stop it making money, although they would say it would. And the earlier set of reforms is about getting back to preserving price stability, not just because that is important, the efficiency in the economy, because if you think in terms of the United States and the euro area, really, really big parts of the world, but also here, if we lose control of price stability, we are kicking ourselves in, well, worse than the shins, at the most difficult period of political history that has faced us for a very, very long time. Thank you.